Recording. So I'm just going to do that again. I'm delighted, excited that George is here to speak about the trauma practice model, our triphasic approach, our unique approach. York University has spent years working on a research project that somebody in George's position who's been working with the analytics is the best person to present on this at this time. And I'm really excited because I know what the outcome is. Uh, but it's been years in the making with a real civilian population, and tells us a lot about what this model, the trauma practice model, really can do for your clients, for our clients. And it's been a very big project and a huge undertaking. And there's multiple papers that are being published right now and being recognized in very prominent journals. So, George, I just want to start by saying thank you so much for moving the project forward because, I know what it's taken. I've been there from the beginning. It was a monster of a project, and it's now starting to pay off. I'm just really delighted to have been part of it. And thank you for your work on it. And I'm just going to say, usually the way we do these conversations is that if people have a question, you could put up your hand, or if George, you prefer, people can ask questions as we go along or at the end. So maybe you'll frame that as best as you like. And I think there are more people who will be popping in as we go along. But I'm going to hand it over to you. You have ability to upload slides and thank you very much, George. Can you introduce
Fantastic.
yourself, please?
Absolutely. And thank you, first of all, so much, Anna, for the brief overview and introduction. As Anna mentioned, I'm part of the York University, not research team for the university, but I'm representing the Trauma and Attachment Lab. Our lab has been closely working with Anna's clinicians and Anna's practice for years now, on this project. And she did, yes, mention we've had multiple publications. I'm going to go over kind of 5 published studies that have come out in the past 2 or 3 years, specifically regarding trauma practice, that are both focused on the individual therapy component and the group therapy component. I think the emphasis on amount of time that this research has taken really kind of goes to show the difficulty of working with naturalistic studies where clients are in the community and clients face actual hurdles like financial concerns or moving away or kind of day-to-day living, specifically even more so with varied degrees of clinician proficiency and intervention experience and all these things. We really wanted to kind of phrase this study in a way where we could show that this intervention is useful and practical to actual clinical practice in day-to-day life, as opposed to effective studies that we see where people are put in hospitals, very controlled environments, and kind of unreplicable in that way when you're trying to implement it into your practice. So let me very briefly share my screen here, and I will just pull up some slides. And let me reduce this. For questions, please feel free to jump in at any point because I don't think I will be seeing hands up while I have this in full screen. Anna, I was going to very briefly go over a brief overview of trauma practice. Do you think that would be necessary, or would it just make more sense to go right into the study? I don't know how familiar everybody is with it, and I'm not sure if I'll do it justice, but I can spend maybe 5 minutes on that if that makes
Could you
sense.
just do that? I think that would be really helpful. We're going to use this video. We're going to post it to the website. So if people can tolerate the 5 minutes, that would be great.
Okay, perfect, no
Thank
problem.
you.
So perfect. So we're going to start with just a very brief overview, and then I'm going to kind of go through the studies that we've done so far, the journals that we've published in, and kind of what we've been aiming to do. So just for a brief overview of trauma practice, um, some of the key features of trauma practice are the fact that it targets trauma impacts across cognition, body behavior, and emotion relationship. It's kind of all encompassing to individual functioning and kind of environment functioning. It's presented as a flexible clinical toolbox, so it's not necessarily directive in a way where it's number of session oriented or bound to a certain sequence or bound to specific tools or techniques that need to be used. It's very organized surrounding client collaboration, their readiness, and their specific phase of treatment and what their needs might be. because we know trauma presentations and any kind of mental health presentations do tend to be extremely varying based on origins, type of trauma, and experiences clients have had, both, in discrimination in systems, legal systems, and things like this. Um, it does integrate components of CBT, BT, emotion focused therapy, narrative therapies, and somatic techniques. And there's a lot of components to draw from. It's organized into three key phases. One is the safety and stabilization phase, where um, the real or active danger is addressed. These phases are based on Judith Herman's treatment of trauma from her book from 1993, which would be fantastic to read if anybody has not yet. But the initial phase addresses the active danger, the differences between being safe and feeling safe, teaching self-soothing and self-rescue, and practicing these skills during trauma recall, kind of this feeling of being present and being able to process before we actually go into the processing. It's meant to establish a more positive prognosis and alliance between the clinician and the client, as a lot of you may know. Um, Phase two is the actual processing phase, where we work on relaxation, exposure, and cognitive processing of trauma. And this is where we try to work to transform anxious responses to regulated engagement as we move on to the actual processing and then reconnection, which is phase three. And these are more practical behavioral steps towards community and relational re-engagement, where the individual kind of goes back into the wider social and systemic circles where they can function kind of in the future. The therapy, like we said, is flexible, so it only concludes when the client reliably maintains their safety and is able to kind of go on. Trauma distress is significantly reduced to a degree where they can function in day-to-day society, and a meaningful reconnection to the broader world is achieved. Now, to go over our studies, we've published 5 studies so far, primarily in the past 2 years. The first study was actually completed by one of our undergraduate students as his thesis for a comorbid depressive symptom changes in triphasic therapy, TPRP. And his part of his thesis was looking at the comorbid depression symptoms and their change over time. This was published in 2024 in the Journal of Psychotherapy Integration. The next paper is the paper I spearheaded. So this is direct trauma-related symptom improvement in TPRP, and this will be very much focusing on individual symptoms of trauma, regardless of a clinical diagnosis or clinical threshold met for PTSD. And then the remainder of the papers were primarily worked on by Cassie, one of our lab members that spearheaded most of this project and is currently on mat leave, some with me and some with other students in the lab. One of her individual papers specifically focuses on direct clinical levels of PTSD symptom improvement. This was published in Psychological Trauma, Theory, Research, and Practice, and Policy. And the other 2 papers are specifically surrounding the trauma groups, community-based phase 1 online treatment groups, one looking at the effectiveness of the groups in general, and one looking at group climate and satisfaction in relation to the therapy and the treatment response as an outcome. So these were both published in the International Journal of Group Psychotherapy. Before I go on, does anybody have any questions? I'm just going to go through the individual studies now and kind of talk about what we found. Some of this may not be chronologically ordered, and there's a reason for that. I'm assuming everybody knows research is sometimes very difficult to publish in the timeline that you want to publish. So we'll begin with the Norden et al. Paper looking at depressive symptoms in TPRP. This was actually the first one published. This was an individual study paper with a number of clients at 39, primarily female, Caucasian, and college educated. So we were looking at comorbid depression outcomes following TPRP interventions for trauma. So we did not necessarily require a diagnosis of PTSD or depression, but 51% of participants reported 5 or more traumatic events over the course of their lives, and a majority of them were actually meeting clinical threshold, just never been diagnosed at this point. The primary measure that we used for this one and the next study was the trauma symptom checklist, a brief measure of 40 items, kind of looking at subscales of trauma that include depression, anxiety, dissociation, sexual trauma, sexual disturbances, and sleep disturbances. So for this specific paper, Lucas Norden looked at the depression subscales and overall changes over time. This will be relevant to the next study as well. We created clinical comparison scores from an outpatient validity study from 1997 This researcher basically reported the average score of clinically threshold meeting patients in their outpatient unit for depression. So this average score was used to determine if they met clinical threshold prior to the intervention. Yes, I think somebody has a raised hand.
That's me. I just want to point out, and I find this to be one of the most interesting aspects of the study, that we can see that although you are identifying depression, by using the trauma practice approach, treating trauma, you're reducing depressive symptoms. And that is something that made Norton's uh, research and his article very, very relevant and interesting.
Absolutely. And to your point, Anna, and to my point before, there's a lot of comorbidity when it comes to trauma. Trauma very seldom represents itself alone in and of itself. There's always other factors that are playing in, like anxiety as well, which we will also see will significantly improve over the course of the therapy. But yes, to your point, absolutely. Like depression is very treatable with this modality, regardless of whether it's being targeted or not. Kind of all these symptoms that are typically coming, which are, I feel like trauma and depression have a lot of comorbid symptoms, like the withdrawal, like the social aspects and the lack of energy, or maybe the irritability or things like this. So it's very interesting to see how much they all come together. Um, for the organization of the study, we collected data at 6 time points. So we did pre-intervention, which was T0, immediately following phase 1 of trauma practice, following phase 2, following phase 3, and then 6 month post therapy conclusion. This was kind of our follow-up period. In terms of analyses, we looked at linear regression models to see kind of the average trajectory. So maybe I'll just start with figure 2 now, this figure on the right side. This is the average trajectory of symptom scores within our clinical sample over time. You can see the time points at the bottom, and it's also indicating the number of clients completed at each time point. Obviously, we had some difficulty reaching everybody at 6 month follow-up, as is very usual for naturalistic studies, which is kind of the point we were trying to make. Um, on the y-axis, you can see that these are the TSC-40 depression subscale scores, kind of ranging from 0 up to 25. The gray dots are the individual data points for our clients. So this is the amount of depressive symptoms they're reporting at any given time in the time points. The black line is the average score, and the gray area around the black line is the 95% confidence interval. Now, Lucas didn't add this for his paper, but somewhere around 10, it's actually 9.75, is the clinical threshold of the system points to meet an actual diagnosis of depression. So you will see as the average trajectory is slowly going down, somewhere right after the safety and stabilization phase, which is T1, is when the average score, the average clinical score in the client base that we have is actually going to subclinical levels, i.e., people no longer meet criteria for depression, primarily following the safety and stabilization stage. If we were looking at the 95% confidence interval, we can do the trauma processing stage at the second time point. But if we're just looking at the average score, it's primarily after phase 1, which I think really kind of contributes to the emphasis Judith Herman and Anna and anybody who practices trauma intervention put on the safety and stabilization phase. It seems to be an unbelievably important component of working with trauma. On the table on the side here, these are reliable change indices. So we didn't just want to show individual client scores. Reliable change indices show to what degree client improvement can be attributed to measurement error or not attributed to measurement error. So any ultimate values above or below 1.96 are said to be statistically significant at the 0.05 percentage, which means there's less than a 5% chance that the positive scores or changes we've seen are due to statistical error. So we wanted to show this in individual client scores as well. If you look at the overall T0 to T3 column, the first column, you'll see from all the clients we have, the vast majority from beginning to ending of therapy are showing very significant or clinically reliable change over the course of their symptoms. And they're all in the minus, meaning that everybody is improving. All their symptoms are decreasing. And we do have columns between phases to see how much change is happening between phases. And it does, again, seem, like I said, the vast majority of change is happening after phase one, with some clients changing more after the phase two piece. We had one client that actually got significantly worse after phase two, which is a relatively big jump considering their phase one involvement. But I feel like that might need some qualitative studies as to see what happened with them. But as you could see, from phase two to phase three, the reconnection phase, there is still primarily in the minus, but not as statistically significant as after the first piece. So that was our first study specifically related to depression. Our next study is this was supposed to be my study, but Cassie's study was actually published afterwards, so I'm going to cover that one first. Harmson et al. Actually wanted to look at the overall trauma composite, the overall clinical level of trauma symptoms and post-traumatic stress, and how that improved over the course of therapy. So we both used the TSC-40, the same measure as in the first study. And we also looked at the post-traumatic stress disorder checklist, or the PCL-5, as it's outlined in the DSM-5. This was the same number of participants. It was 39. We hadn't finished all of our data collection at this time point. But what Harmson et al. Found was that overall post-traumatic symptoms and symptom-related distress were all significantly reducing over the course of therapy. So same as in the previous one, we have the measure scores on the side and the time points at the bottom. You can see the shaded area in the top table here. That is the clinical threshold for PTSD symptoms. 33 is the number of symptoms that, as outlined by the DSM, to meet kind of this criteria. You'll see that the average score was in the clinical threshold as we began therapy. This paper didn't necessarily look at individual subscales, but they did look at these overall scores. And you can see again that after the safety and stabilization phase, the average score is going down. People are no longer meeting criteria for PTSD as this is going on. And then you can also see that the related distress in several other domains as measured by the TSC-40 is also going down at the same time. So this was kind of the main focus of that paper. And this is where my paper comes in afterwards, which was published before that one. I specifically looked at the individual trauma symptom components of the therapy. So I didn't necessarily want to see if there was a PTSD clinical threshold or whether somebody had a diagnosis. I specifically wanted to see if somebody came to the clinic saying, I don't really suffer from anxiety or depression, but I suffer from severe dissociation as a result of PTSD. If this therapeutic model was relevant to all types of presentations, regardless of how all-encompassing it was to a clinical degree to meet PTSD criteria. So what I looked at were the subscales of the TSC-40, which was dissociation, depression. I looked at again with a slightly larger sample, anxiety, sexual issues, and sleep disturbances. And again, the clinical comparison scores were derived from the outpatient validity study from the TSC-40 measure. So I have a lot of graphs here, but they're all kind of showing the same thing. Going from top to the side to bottom, this is just the average trajectory of change from dissociation symptoms, anxiety symptoms, depression symptoms, sexual trauma symptoms, sleep disturbances, and sexual problem symptoms. Now, the red lines I've added to these graphs are the clinical threshold lines. This is where we determine if clients meet clinical or non-clinical threshold to be anxious, depressed, dissociated, have sexual trauma, have sleep disturbance, and all these things. And as you can see, I won't go into every single one of them, but there's a very common trend of everything reducing under the clinical threshold on average. Some clients know after the safety and stabilization phase, more particularly, and I think probably most in depression and sleep disturbances, but very significantly in dissociation and anxiety as well, which I think obviously you see very often with people that have gone through trauma. For the two subscales, the sexual trauma index and the sexual problems, where the average score actually started under the clinical threshold, which may be the truth, and it also may be how clients are reporting. This is a more sensitive type of trauma. I did an additional study to see whether clients that did begin over the clinical threshold were ending underneath. And the majority did in both cases. You can see here the black dots, they represent clients that started above and ended below. You can also see lines that some clients showed a increase in symptoms, but the majority of clients that started above the clinical threshold actually finished below by the end of therapy for both indexes, which I think is still very indicative of the fact that clients are getting better if they're in the clinical range, regardless of, the average trajectory, which is still getting better. The improvement is there. And then I also did my reliable change indices. I broke them up by client and every symptom from dissociation, anxiety, depression to sexual trauma, sleep disturbances, and sexual problems. The green highlights represent everybody that had a clinically reliable decrease in symptoms in all of these domains. As you can see, there's at least half or more clinically reliable ones, but if you look closely, almost all of the scores for all of them are in the minus. Almost everybody is improving, regardless of it being maybe clinically significant at that point in time. Everybody is getting better across all of the symptom domains as a result of engaging in trauma practice, which I think is incredible. These are very comprehensive domains, and I feel like they appear in quite a lot of presentations. Um, there were some increases in sexual problems, and again, I think some qualitative interviewing and data here would have been useful. These are individual clients. We don't know what necessarily was happening in their lives. I'm just looking at the numbers here, but the vast majority are showing improvements, and the vast majority of that are showing clinically significant improvements. I love this study. This was very, very fun to do. And then after that, we moved on to our online group trauma intervention research. So this was also spearheaded by Cassie. The study was primarily me and her. We had 178 participants from the groups that were led by Anna's team, primarily female. Mean age was 43 with a standard deviation of about 12 years, so a solid age range. This initial paper examined the feasibility of online group therapy for high-risk trauma survivors. High risk as in people who were still likely to be in the environment where trauma occurred or were at risk of, getting re-traumatized or had comorbidities. That was kind of the component that we were seeing primarily. The group was organized as an 8-week group. It was psychoeducation and skills based, and it was a phase 1 kind of processing group. So no trauma processing, but safety and stabilization and initial skill building. Trauma symptoms were primarily measured using the PCL-5 at 3 time points this time, not 6. So we were doing it registration at 1 week prior to treatment and immediately post-treatment. The reason it was split up this way is because we wanted to see if they were waitlist effects. We wanted to see if people were improving between registration and the start of the treatment to see how much of the actual change is attributed to the intervention. And then we wanted to see immediately pre and immediately post to kind of get that net worth of the improvements that we were seeing from the intervention itself. So the emphasis on this study was examining both the overall level of post-traumatic stress in the PCL-5, but also specific subdomains, which included intrusive thoughts, avoidance, negative cognitions or negative mood, and arousal. So I'm going to show you the next graph here. These are primarily the types of traumatic events that were reported. We used the LEC-5 just to kind of measure what people were experiencing. The vast majority of people reported multiple traumas and multiple instances of trauma. So the graph you're seeing is showing the categories, but it may not necessarily be reflective of the number of people and number of events that have happened. But the primary areas of trauma were physical assault, other sexual assault, other unwanted sexual encounter, and transportation accident. Those were kind of seen most commonly in this subgroup, which was kind of the same in our individual group, but we didn't actually publish on the actual types. So here for this graph, this is where we're looking at the change scores in the overall trauma symptomatology, the clinical piece of the PTSD kind of diagnosis. So the gray dots are individual data points for our clients from the phases. The red line is the change over the waitlist period. So like I mentioned, between registration and when the intervention actually started. And the green line is the change during the course of the intervention from start to finish. The dotted black line is the clinical threshold, the 33-point symptom for PTSD. As you can see, there was no significant change over the waitlist period, so clients were not necessarily just improving by themselves, so the change is attributed to the intervention. And we can see between the start of the intervention, time 1, and the end, time 2, that there's a significant decrease in overall symptomatology. So approximately 34% of participants demonstrated reliable and clinically relevant reductions in PTSD symptoms. and approximately 28% of those people that met clinical threshold for PTSD no longer met it post-intervention. So the reduction is practically in one third of the population that showed improvements went from a clinical to non-clinical score by the end of these online groups. Um, I neglected to mention this, but the reason we were looking specifically at online groups is that this was starting to pick up during COVID, and the effectiveness of online groups in general was starting to be examined. We knew there was effectiveness in groups for trauma processing in person, but we specifically wanted to see if the online component would affect how this was received and what the outcomes were. And it did not. They were just as effective. And I think it opened up doors for quite a bit of involvement and quite a bit more people to come in from various areas and various means, in terms of engaging in therapy. So I think that was very important to note. And then for the specific subdomains from the PCL5, like I mentioned, the intrusive thoughts, the avoidance, the negative moods and cognitions, and the arousals, you can see again, there's almost no difference between T0 and T1, which is the waitlist period, but then between T1 and T2 on all of the subdomains, the average number of scores, the box has moved down, it's decreased, and so has the mean and the median. Everything is lower than when they did at the start of therapy. So I think the main takeaway here is that online trauma processing groups are viable, they do work, they are significantly helpful for clients. Um, and this is why kind of we kept going with everything. And the final study that we published, also published in 2026, more recently in January, was a sub-study of the online trauma group effectiveness. We were looking at the effect of group climate and kind of client satisfaction in relation to the outcome. We wanted to see if there was any predictive value in group climate and satisfaction, as in if clients were more satisfied and if the group climate was more positive, did that directly translate into more positive outcomes and more engagement in the therapy? The number of participants in this group was 80, so slightly less. Primarily female, again, same mean age, around 46, standard deviation 10 years, and primarily Caucasian. So the groups were organized as an 8-week psychoeducational skills-based trauma therapy group, like I mentioned in the other one. These were specifically all three groups. We looked at recovery and resiliency, the lean-in groups, and the trauma-informed medication groups. I think Anna can probably speak more to the types of groups, but the point is that it was not necessarily just the recovery and resiliency, which was the main group we were having. We saw the effects of group climate and satisfaction across all of the types of the groups. There were no significant differences between groups when we looked at the scores, so everything was kind of pulled together and the analyses were done together. So we looked at the overall trauma scores and indices from the trauma symptom checklist and the PCL5. And then we also examined the group climate with the group climate questionnaire, the short form, the GCQS. And this had three main domains. We were looking at group engagement, group conflict, and group avoidance, and how that was in relation to the outcomes. And then a satisfaction survey we created for the study that was looking at three key domains. It was satisfaction with the facilitator, how well they were doing, satisfaction with the individual progress, how every client felt they were doing, and kind of overall satisfaction with the group utility and practicality, so how useful these skills were and how much we could engage in them or they could engage in them over time. I don't actually have a graph because we did not publish the graph for the outcome for the primary models, but I can just let you know. So in terms of group climate, we found there was moderate predictive value of group engagement in relation to outcomes. So the more clients were engaging in groups, outcomes were slightly better. There was no significant predictive value in group conflict or group avoidance. In terms of outcomes, I will say this is most likely also the result of Anna's incredible clinical team. I don't think there was much group conflict and much group avoidance. I think they were very good at, managing the situations, the emotions, the intergroup dynamics. And I think partly us not seeing that may just be because they are such good clinicians. So this is something that we were going to look at in the future. And in terms of satisfaction predicting outcomes, satisfaction was a very large predictor of outcomes. So first of all, we looked at overall satisfaction, and then we actually did post hoc analyses to see which of these domains, satisfaction with facilitators, with the individual progress, or group utility, showed the most improvements, where this predictive value was coming from. And the predictive value was primarily coming from the utility and practicality component. So the more clients could feel like they could use these skills in their day-to-day lives, that they were translatable to other things, and how practical the groups were in terms of engagement, learning skills, and what they could take away, the change was greater. So if you would look at here, the higher change, the blue scores or the blue boxes, the average satisfaction increased, which was predictive of an increase, a decrease in symptoms or an increase in group outcomes. One more study that I do not have on my slides as not a study. One of our lab students is writing a book, which is incorporating trauma practice. I did reach out to her to get a bit more information to see if she could give me something. I haven't co-authored on the book, so I don't have too much information on that, but there is a book in progress now as well, and I'm told it is going very well and that it will be ready for publication sometime soon. So hopefully you guys will get to see that too. So with that, I'm just going to stop sharing here. Because those were our 5 studies. And I think we can take questions now if people I know there was many, many things. And I'll preface this by saying that I was intimately involved with 3 of these studies, not all 5, and I will do my best to answer all of them. Cassandra, who was involved in all 5, is on mat leave. God bless her. So I just wanted to make sure that I get you guys this information. And yeah, thank you for listening. So if anybody has any questions,
Bravo. Just want to say thank you so very much, George. You did an incredible job of presenting that. And I'm looking forward to seeing the book as well. And I'll hand it over to people who are listening to ask questions and you to answer, George. And of course, it's remarkable what you did. So thank you.
thank you. I was trying to go quickly to kind of get through all of them, but I'm thinking maybe I've gone too quickly. Alan, do you want to jump in with the first question?
Hi, I don't have a question. George, you did a great job. Thank you for doing this nice presentation. I took this training for Tri-Phasic from Dr. Bernovsky. I took the course 6 years ago. I've been practicing that. I was about to say that there are some catalysts, something that can even make the effects even better. Uh, Group therapy, I'm happy that you mentioned that. Uh, Triphasic is working very well, and I saw that in my clients.
Mhm.
People got better results when they were away from work because when they constantly have exposure to that traumatic incidents, of course, it can delay the
Mm,
process. That's one thing because when you are doing your regression analysis, that's one of those predictors you can probably factor in uh,
mm,
something there. That group therapy can help very much. For example, people who took Carla's courses in mindfulness, they did much better, especially in terms of getting in peace with themselves
mm,
and that the last phase of reconnecting to the normal life. This was one thing, and another thing is uh, there were a few outliers that you highlighted with red, especially when with the sexual dysfunction. Actually, I had a couple of these clients, and I'm doing my PhD now. And last year, I had a course in biological basis of behavior,
mm,
and I used a bit of that in my practice. It helps, especially I saw that sexual dysfunctioning in male patients. And when I asked them to have blood work and they realized that testosterone level is significantly low, as soon as they received treatment for that, believe it or not, it helped them very much, not only with that area of their life, but in the whole uh, trauma treatment.
mm,
That
mhm,
was
mhm.
another thing, just personal experience. I haven't made a paper yet. I'm working on a paper now. Hopefully, who knows, maybe sometime later this year it gets published. But yeah, this is another factor. I just wanted to say that what is the reason for these outliers? To me, to my little experience, uh, personality disorders can add to the problem. The person has to go to work, and another thing is some biological roots or biological reasons for behavior. Thank you for listening.
Of course, and thank you, Ellen. And absolutely, you're right. And I think we've seen this I've seen this in a number of individual trauma cases as well. And I think one of not the issues, but one of the caveats of working in naturalistic studies like this is there's people that come in with varying presentations from varying circumstances. It will depend on type of trauma. It will depend on parental or intimate partner reaction to the trauma. It will depend on attachment styles. It will depend on personality. It will depend on socioeconomic means. I think, to your point, exactly, like there are other factors that are contributing to this. It may also depend on the way the measure is structured. Some people interpret sexual difficulty questions specifically in this measure negatively in some way, and some people may misunderstand. Some people may underreport, they may overreport. I think this is where some of those more qualitative analyses, where we sit down with these people specifically and we think and we say, what was going on in your life at this point, at this point, and this point, would be super useful to what you said. Exactly. There may be many other things, including biology, that are contributing to this. So yes, that was a fantastic point. Thank you. Chantel, yes, you had a question or a comment.
A comment. I mean, and kind of like a yes person here. It's because I've done this. I'm not even going to say how long. It's been since I took Anna's initial courses. But for me, some of my clients were in this case and some aren't, because I've used her model quite extensively in my work and in my whole practice here at Masso. And two things is, one is I often stay in safety and stabilization longer than what other people would expect. Everybody wants a quick fix. And I think that that's such an important phase. And I've even had to argue with insurance companies that this person's not prepared to do processing work yet, because we're still in the middle of a legal battle, or we're still in the middle of this or that. And we really need to focus on safety and stabilization. So for me, that part of the study really rings true, and how important and how effective it is in getting ready for the other stuff, because the symptoms go down quite a bit. So they have more of a better rooted sense of where they are to do the processing in a more deep and effective way. So for me, that was one. So that's a big one. And the other is, which wasn't in your study at all, but is something that I have noticed in my practice, is a huge contagion factor. So I often work with First Nations and Inuit, and in that case, I often work with multiple members of the family, which a lot of people say
Mhm.
boundary issues, but in this cultural context, absolutely not. And what happens is, even if I'm working with one family member that starts getting well, the entire household gets better in crazy ways, like really statistically crazy ways.
Mhm.
From everybody to be drug involved and struggling with addictions and trauma and risk behaviors, to everybody being employed and abstaining and contributing to the household in profound ways. And then if I work with a whole family, it's huge. So in that cultural setting, especially, I see huge difference. So for me, I'm a strong, supporter of this model and use it daily. But that's some of the things that I see in it, from the type of practice I do. So thank you for
Absolutely.
the study.
Thank you, Chantel. No, and you're absolutely right. I was actually, when I was looking at the data for these individual studies that I was doing, we have timelines for when these phases are ended. Not everybody is ending at the same time, and everybody's clinicians and clients are starting at different times. But an overall average, safety and stabilization takes twice as long as the other stages. And a lot of clients stayed there for quite a long time, just based on comfort levels and what clinicians thought was right. And to your point about the culture and the family, I think ideally in every intervention, the family and social systems should be involved. I see very, very often individuals who are labeled to have the issue or the diagnosis, putting in quite a lot of work that then gets negated when they go home or go back to an abusing environment, to go somewhere where it's stressful, to Alan's point, to work, maybe whatever the situation may be, where other people don't use these skills and other people don't help this change get maintained, and all these things that are happening. So to your point, as everybody can improve, everybody can also get work, because in some families I found the symptoms that an individual may be having actually serve a function in the family system. They give them a space in the family system, which actually lets the rest of the family function more. One of the people we had in our group study, them having these symptoms and them, going to group therapy and them working on mental health this much meant parents had more time to take other siblings to extracurricular activities. So parents kind of just let it happen without getting involved. And this was a big contributor to the trauma. It was constant emotional invalidation as the child in this family. But parents were even resistant at some point because they were like, well, no, she's doing well. We're doing good. We have good time. And it's just hard to see. I think there's components there that really need to be worked on in general. And in an ideal world, we would work on all of them. I think you're absolutely right. Um, thank you. Anybody else with any questions or comments?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chantel. You raised some really excellent points, as you do as well, Alan. I'm just going to say it's very interesting, this idea of staying in phase one. And we have a number of markers with the trauma practice approach where we ask ourselves questions like, can the client demonstrate the capacity for self-soothing before they even move into phase two? And there are a number of different ones that we kind of go over or should go over with our clients. And I think Chantel is a really good example of somebody who really thinks things through well and understands the models that she uses. And so your statement, Chantel, that you stay in phase one makes a lot of sense to me, because I know you work with chronic complex, you work with CPTSD primarily. And in those cases, we're going to see that not only do your clients need to stay in phase one for a period of time until they can at least demonstrate that they're in safety, that they can self-soothe and things like this, but you may go into phase two and even phase three and then have to come back to phase one again. And that's what I would consider good management of complex PTSD. So Chantel, thank you for raising that and highlighting that as well, George. I think it's just it's a crucial piece of doing the model well.
And thank you, Anna, for adding that. I think this is something, I mean, obviously a lot of people here know about trauma practice, but this is where that flexibility comes in again, to be able to go back a phase and work on safety again. I think that rarely happens in structured therapeutic modalities. As useful as they are, I feel like there's less room for that kind of leeway. And as we know, like, clients don't progress linearly. Nobody does. I feel like it's always a back and forth. So
And the other piece that I just want to highlight too, and now I'm going to talk about Carla, who's here with us today, is this integration of a group-based model that reinforces trauma care and gives people practice time, skills, and tools in a supportive environment that allows for integration of the capacity for self-soothing, which we often, I mean, we can give people skills in session and then they practice them with us. But when they are left in a group where they're seeing other people practicing and they're getting a chance to practice it consistently over a period of time. And obviously, Carla with trauma-informed meditation, and then we have the resilience and recovery and the emotional regulation groups, all of them just reinforce the model. And they give that opportunity for the launching to phase two. When there's that consistency over time, people have a better chance of moving safely into that phase two work. So, for me, it's just really exciting to see and hear, what York University has been able to really develop over time. It has been quite the endeavor, and I'm just so impressed to see what you had to show us today. And when I started by saying, like, nobody will be better at explaining this than George, certainly I would have not done as good a job as you have done, George. And your level of understanding of the analytics is really, really profound and beneficial. So I'm very, very grateful. Anybody else have questions for George?
Carla, yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as you were speaking, Chantel, and equally as you were sort of aligning in what Chantel was describing, Anna, that oftentimes in groups we're going back to the beginning to our first few sessions that really are about being able to get our bodies out of stress response, how, when we're in fight, flight, and freeze, how can we physiologically change the way that our bodies are reacting in a given moment. And even throughout, 8 weeks, which is obviously time limited to an extent, I would say each session we're going back and learning and relearning and working on those tools because they are so relevant and are so important. And oftentimes we have clients coming into group speaking about how they are implementing these practices, not only in their lives, but also sometimes in their individual therapy, in their processing, which is so remarkable to me. I think that is, the two really are so symbiotic in that way, where people can come in and practice and watch other people practice and watch them, in fact, sometimes have a really hard time with it and not know how to approach it. And that almost, in my opinion, creates a lot more fodder for learning how to then take it yourself and implement it. Um, and so I think it's really, I would say, exciting, in fact, and rewarding in many ways too, to see the results of these studies. Um, for me, personally in the group therapy setting, but I think, the broad efficacy of what you've been showing us is really impressive. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Carla. And just to the point about the studies, this was a very watered down, chewed up version. I will give Anna links to all the papers. You can read all of them. There's a lot more consideration going in there. They're very interesting. Obviously, what I've said is correct, but there's a lot more to consider. And I think if you guys liked it, it will be very nice to kind of go into the nitty gritty a little bit of what's written down as well. But thank you, Carla. Yes, it's so nice to see that they're taking these skills and using them individually too. I feel like this is where we saw with that practicality and utility of the group and the skills was the biggest predictor of symptom reduction from the groups. Like they're saying this is usable. We can actually do this, which is really nice because I feel like the fact that it is usable across situations and across time contributes to that sense of safety in knowing that you can always come back to these skills and you can always go back and start over and you can always use them in these times of distress and processing. But this is just me ranting now because I find this quite exciting. So anybody else?
I'll jump in quick. Thank you, George, for
Yeah.
the presentation. Thoroughly enjoyed it. It's always nice to, I guess it's helpful to also see the support or the research supporting, the phase models that we use anyway. Like everybody else said, my knowledge comes from Dr. Anna's initial courses. I often go back to them. As a review, always fun and nice to go back to. And like everybody also, like they mentioned, I've also seen significant, results or positive impacts going phase by phase. Like you said, it's not a linear process. I may jump back to safety and stabilization and then processing, sometimes maybe back here and then forward. So very impactful works. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation today.
No problem. Thank you. And exactly what you mean. I feel like you guys see a lot of the clinical change and the clinically meaningful change. You guys see the testimonials, you see this change in real time. But I think the unfortunate reality of psychological support and research and funding and all this is they very much require numbers. They require results. They require seeing papers. They require these things. So I feel like it was quite an honor being able to produce this for you guys in a way where we say, hey, you see these things that these clinicians are saying work, they actually work. Here's what we're seeing. Like,
Yeah.
dispute it now, because as much as TP has been used, it's still relatively new and honestly, in my opinion, very underused for how unbelievably helpful it is for quite a range of symptoms and presentations. So I'm very honored that Anna let us work with her clinical team and Anna let us do all of this because it's great to actually get to contribute in this way and be the other half of what we need to make an intervention plausible to help more people.
Thank you.
All right. I think we're getting somewhere near the end. Anna, do you have anything to add or any concluding thoughts? I'm just very happy to be here today. Thank you guys for letting me present and for listening. I know this must be busy time as every time is busy for psychologists and students alike.
We're going to put this on the website so people can watch it, and it would be fantastic to be able to get that list of published and to be published, because there are published, there are articles that are already published, and there are some articles and the book that are still to be published. So it'd be great to have, it all lined up so that we could add it, and then people can listen and watch and think about the accomplishments of your team, doing the research and doing exactly what you said, giving us some validation that not only are we saying that this really is making a difference, because we see it with our clients, our patients, the people we care for, but that you're seeing it as well as researchers analyzing the actual model, both in the group settings and in the individual model. So I just want to thank you so much for the work you've done. If there are any other questions or anything that anybody needs to say, please do that now. Otherwise, I just want to thank you, George, before we log off, and really appreciate the York University team and all that you have accomplished. And, by doing this research, this very practical research, you give back to the community of people who are seeking the right care. And now they understand that there's something that can really make a difference. And, these research studies help us show that.
Good. I'm glad. I'm hoping they help contribute to your clinic and to your clients as well. We're very happy to help. Thank you so much, guys. We'll have a fantastic rest of your day, and I'm going to send you the list of those articles. And yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out. Anna has my email. She can circulate if she would like. And I'll be happy to answer, hop back on, or do anything we need.
So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I'll look forward to speaking with you again next month, and you know how to contact me if you need to. Once this is all posted, I'll make sure everybody gets a link to that too. Have a great day. Bye, everyone.